Hello, my name is Reva Bhalla, and today I have the man himself, founder and chairman George Friedman, to discuss with me the main trends that we're looking at for the second quarter. Thanks for being here, George.
I'm the man.
So, George, we've obviously been covering the U.S.-Russian standoff in Eurasia for years now. Really, in the first quarter, we saw that spill into the open over Ukraine. And of course, we're going to see threats telegraphed from the Baltics down to Eastern Europe, the Caucasus. But what are the limits of this confrontation that you see?
Well, from the Russian point of view, they don't really care what happens in Ukraine so long as it doesn't become part of NATO, doesn't become part of the EU, doesn't become a Western dagger pointed at them. The red line is if the United States begins sending military advisors, if the Europeans start sending weapons, things like that, that's something the Russians can't live with. They can barely live with this.
But there's a difference between sending advisors and rotating in troops on a temporary basis versus permanent basing with a more forward deployment on the Eastern Front, right?
But the Russians are fully aware of how the Americans work. First come the advisors, then come the advisors' bases, and so on and so forth. The point, however, is that the Russians cannot and will not tolerate the integration of Ukraine into the Western defense system. That's their red line. For the United States, it's a very different red line because, one, the Americans really don't have the military capacity to engage in Ukraine. And secondly, their stakes are not that high. If the Ukraine is part of the CIS bloc, the Americans will live with that. So it's more a probe. Now, from the Russian point of view, the question really is what to do now to make certain that this doesn't evolve into something they can't bear. And that's what they're really playing with right now.
And they're different tiers, right? Because Ukraine, that's of vital security interest to the Russians. When we look at an issue over Moldova, for example, of course we're going to see plenty of threats there, military posturing and the breakaway region of Transnistria. But how should we distinguish between the Ukrainian situation and Moldova and the Baltics?
It's not that Moldova isn't important to the Russians. There are two rivers, the Prut, the Dniester. The Dniester is around 70 or 80 miles away from Odessa, a critical port for the Russians, for the Ukrainians. The Russians really don't want Moldova part of the Western system, but at the same time, they don't have the capacity to really do something there. It is surrounded by Ukrainian territory. Resupplying substantial troops that would be operating in the region would force them to send troops across to Ukraine. To do that, they'd have to seize part of the Ukraine.
Right.
It is way more than they can handle. Remember, the Russians have a capable armed force within limits. Seizing all of Ukraine, pacifying it, and then launching an attack into Moldova, that's a bit much for them to do. So it's not that it's not important to them, it's just beyond their reach.
Okay. And so the Russians are also going to be prowling beyond Europe, looking for distractions to tie the U.S. down, to really get the U.S. to understand that there will be consequences for pushing too hard. Iran is, of course, a place I would look. Personally, I don't think that the Iranians are going to go too far with the Russians. They can leverage it in their negotiation with the U.S., but there will be limits.
Well, it can become very painful for the Americans. The Americans had one schedule of concessions they were prepared to make to the Iranians on the assumption they were completely isolated. The more options the Iranians have, the less that schedule holds. The United States has to make more concessions. So it's not a question of black and white, of an agreement or no agreement. It's a question of who's going to make more concessions. And that's where the Russians will play. The Russians will try to show the Americans there is a price to pay if you want to dominate the Ukraine, if you want Ukraine to be pro-Western, and one of the prices is going to be at a central point in your national strategy, Iran.
Yeah, but there still are going to be constraints to that because the Iranians remember that they've been used and abused by the Russians plenty of times before. So when it comes to priority, there's a difference between a tactic and using the Russian card and prioritizing a fundamental negotiation with the United States for its long-term security.
Sometimes a tactic turns into a strategy. So certainly they're going to use the Russian card. If they find that there is no yield from the West, it is the Western deal or no deal, they may sit down and a faction will emerge in Tehran that says, look, the Russians are dangerous. The West is dangerous. We live in a dangerous world.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, who can we rely on for our national security? The Russians really don't want, obviously, the Iranians to have nuclear weapons.
Right.
But they believe the Americans are more worried about it than they are.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to use the American fear
right.
as a lever. Now, these levers can get out of hand. So you can't predict where it's going to go, but you can say this much. Under the circumstances, the Russians are going to look at Iran as a place to cause problems for the United States. They've got to get some sort of lever against the United States, and that's it.
Okay. Well, let's look at the other side of Europe then. A lot of stress that we expect in the second quarter. And you are working on your book right now. You've been talking a lot about your Hungarian roots in that book, and I think our readers may think that Stratfor is abnormally obsessed with Hungary if they read us, but there's a reason. Why do we look at Hungary as the laboratory in understanding the European crisis?
Hungary is one of the few countries that have been badly hit by the crisis, but has a very strong central government. Viktor Orban commands an overwhelming majority in the parliament, and he has the ability to act. Orban is a nationalist. He is someone who's comfortable with the idea of Europe, but ultimately he is the leader of Hungary, and he will act on behalf of Hungary. So, for example, Hungarians borrowed mortgage money from European banks denominated in euros or francs or even yen.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that happened was that the Hungarian currency fell. Now, in many countries, their national government base is that tough, pay it back. Orban said to the banks, you're getting paid back in forints, not in euros or yen or whatever you sold it, and you're only going to get a percentage back. And it's take it or leave it. And in that tough stance, the EU said nothing. They essentially accepted that he do this. And everybody's watching Hungary because it has such a strong government, because the government is protecting the national interests of the Hungarians, is pretty indifferent to the Europeans. How far are they going to go? Where are they going to go? And countries, not only in Eastern Europe, but in Southern Europe as well, that have been badly hit by austerity, are going to ask the question, should we follow the Hungarian lead in being much more aggressive in dealing with the European banks? And at some point here, there's going to be a confrontation between the Hungarians and the Europeans, because there's going to be a point beyond which the Hungarians can't go.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that happened in an election that was held last week is Orban's popularity was reaffirmed, and it's very clear that the Hungarians are going to hang very tough. So Hungary has become the canary in the mine. Watching what the Hungarians do with a live or die along these lines is going to tell us a lot about what Europe is going to look like.
Thank you, George, for your insight, and thank you all for joining us. We touched on just a few issues here, but there's much more on our website where we discuss the forecast in detail. Thank you again.
Thank you.